Story 1. The Hidden Guest. Living in a suburban home has its perks: spacious rooms, a quiet neighborhood, and the sense of security that comes with being in a familiar environment. My family's house was no exception. It was a high ranch with a split-level design, and I, being the oldest and the only boy in the family, was given the biggest room, which was on the first floor. The other bedrooms were on the second floor, occupied by my two younger sisters and my parents. At 12 years old, I loved having the space to myself. The room was large enough for a full-sized bed, my own TV, and a video game console. It was a dream come true for a boy my age. The walls of my room were decorated with posters of my favorite athletes and video game characters, and the floor was often strewn with clothes and the remnants of my latest snacks. I felt like I was in my own little world, separate from the rest of the house. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the chaos of family life and just be myself. But as the summer of that year dragged on, what seemed like a privilege began to feel like a curse. The first sign that something was wrong was the sleepless nights. It wasn't uncommon for me to wake up in the middle of the night, but recently it had become a nightly occurrence. The heat was unbearable, so I kept a fan running beside my bed to cool down. The fan provided a steady hum, a white noise that usually lulled me back to sleep. But for 3 nights in a row, I woke up feeling uneasy, my heart pounding for no apparent reason. I would lie there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the anxiety that gripped me. The fan's hum should have been soothing, but instead, it seemed to heighten my senses, making every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, seem amplified and ominous. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was getting worked up over nothing, but the feeling of dread was impossible to shake. On the 4th night, things took a turn for the worse. It was another hot, sticky evening. I had gone to bed after playing video games, the fan blowing cool air across my face. I fell asleep quickly, but as usual, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time I was parched, so I got up to refill my glass of water in the bathroom just outside my room. As I was filling the glass, I heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from my room. I froze, listening intently. The only thing I could hear was the fan, but something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly walked back to my room. I hesitated at the doorway, peering into the darkness. Everything looked normal: my bed, the dresser, the pile of clothes I had left on the floor. But the feeling of unease was stronger than ever. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself to step into the room. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What if there was someone hiding in my closet? Or behind the door? The logical part of my brain tried to assert itself, reminding me that it was probably nothing, just the house settling or the wind outside. But logic was no match for the primal fear that had taken hold of me. Finally, I mustered up the courage to step into the room. I crossed the threshold and immediately felt a chill run down my spine. The room felt different, like the air was heavier, thicker. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I quickly scanned the room, my eyes darting from the bed to the closet to the shadows in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of dread wouldn't go away. Deciding not to risk it, I grabbed a blanket and went upstairs to sleep on the couch in the living room. It was closer to my parents' room, and the thought of being near them was comforting. I settled down, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and tried to fall asleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard another noise, this time from the kitchen. The light from the fridge cast a faint glow into the living room, and I could hear someone rummaging through it. My first thought was that it was one of my parents, or maybe my sister. But when I sat up and looked toward the kitchen, I couldn't see anyone. The layout of the house meant that the kitchen was out of view from the couch, so I couldn't tell who was there. I heard the fridge door close, followed by footsteps heading downstairs to the first floor, my floor. I was too tired to investigate, and the fear of what I might find kept me glued to the couch. I eventually fell asleep again, but the next morning, my mom mentioned something strange. She was folding laundry in my room and told me that it stunk like something had died in there. I didn't smell anything, but her words made my stomach churn. That night, I was more on edge than ever. The heat had finally broken, and my dad had turned on the air conditioning. It was a relief not to have the fan running, but the silence that filled my room was unsettling. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease grew. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up again. My eyes snapped open, and I immediately noticed something was different. The air conditioner had shut off, and the room was silent to silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear anything, any sound that might explain why I was awake. Then I heard a soft, rhythmic breathing. But it wasn't mine. The sound was coming from somewhere in the room, but I couldn't pinpoint where. I sat up slowly, my eyes darting around the room. The closet door was shut tight, and there was no sign of movement. But the breathing continued, steady and calm, as if someone else was there with me. Panic set in as I realized that the only place the sound could be coming from was under my bed. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I scream? Run? Confront whatever or whoever was under there? In the end, curiosity got the better of me. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and knelt down beside it. My hands were trembling as I lifted the edge of the blanket that hung down from the mattress. What I saw made my blood run cold. There under the bed was a man. He was lying on his side, facing me, his eyes closed as if he were asleep. He was large, his body curled up on a pile of blankets that I didn't recognize. His clothes were dirty, his skin grimy, and his hair matted. For a moment, I was frozen in place, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Then instinct kicked in, and I scrambled backward, falling onto my back as I screamed for my dad. The next few moments were a blur of terror and confusion. I heard my parents' door fly open, and my dad's heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs. My mom was right behind him, her voice panicked as she called my name. I pointed frantically at the bed, gasping out the words, "Under the bed. There's someone under the bed." My dad didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the man by the collar and dragging him out from under the bed. The man struggled, but my dad was strong, and he had the element of surprise on his side. My mom was already on the phone, calling 911, as my dad hauled the man out of the house and onto the front lawn. The police arrived quickly, and they took the man away in handcuffs. He was homeless, they said, and had likely been living in our house for days, maybe even weeks. The thought made me sick to my stomach. How long had he been under my bed? How many nights had he watched me sleep, just inches away from where he was hiding? The police found evidence that he had been eating our food, sneaking out at night to raid the fridge while we slept. He had even been using the bathroom, careful not to leave any trace of his presence. But the smell my mom had noticed, the one I had ignored, was a sign that he had been there for much longer than we realized. In the days that followed, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my room. The thought of going back down there, of lying in the same bed where that man had hidden, was too much to bear. My parents tried to reassure me, telling me that he was gone, that he wouldn't come back. But the fear had taken root deep inside me, and no amount of comforting words could make it go away. My dad installed security cameras all around the house, and he even replaced the locks on the doors. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. I spent the next few weeks sleeping in my parents' bed, sandwiched between them, like a child afraid of the dark. But it wasn't the dark. I was afraid of it was the memory of that man, of his silent breathing just inches away from me. Every night after that, I would lie awake for hours, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't heard the breathing. The fear gnawed at me, a constant reminder of how close I had come to real danger. I started to imagine scenarios. What if the man had attacked me? What if he had a weapon? The possibilities were endless and terrifying, and they played out in my mind over and over again. Eventually, I moved back into my room, but I was never the same. The fear of someone hiding under my bed stayed with me for years. Every night, I would check under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains, anywhere someone could be hiding. It became a ritual, a necessary precaution before I could even think about falling asleep. My parents did their best to help me feel safe. They put up new locks, added extra lights outside, and even got a dog to help protect the house. But no matter what they did, the fear was still there. It was like a shadow, always lurking in the back of my mind, waiting to pounce. I tried to talk to my friends about it, but they didn't understand. They thought it was cool, like something out of a horror movie. They didn't realize how real and terrifying it had been, how close I had come to something awful. They laughed it off, told me I was lucky to have such an exciting story to tell. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt violated, scared, and alone. As the years went by, the fear faded, but never fully disappeared. I learned to live with it, to push it to the back of my mind. But every now and then, something would trigger a memory, a creak in the floorboards, a shadow in the corner of my eye, and the fear would come rushing back. I would find myself back in that moment, kneeling beside the bed, lifting the blanket, and seeing the man lying there. Even now, as an adult, I still have moments when I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing for no reason. I listen for that telltale breathing, that sound that haunted my childhood. And every time, I remind myself that it's over, that the man is gone. But deep down, I know that the fear will never truly leave me. It's a part of me now, a scar that time can never heal. It's strange how something like this can change you. Before that summer, I was just a kid, carefree and oblivious to the dangers of the world. But after that night, I grew up fast. I realized that the world isn't as safe as it seems, that danger can be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. I never told anyone outside of my family about what happened. It was too personal, too terrifying to share. But now, as I sit here writing this, I realize that maybe it's time to let it out, to confront the fear that has been haunting me for so long. Maybe by sharing my story, I can finally put the past behind me and move on. Or maybe the fear will always be there, a constant reminder of how fragile our sense of security really is. Because the truth is, no matter how safe we feel, no matter how many locks we put on our doors, there's always the possibility that someone or something is hiding just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And when that moment comes, when the blanket is lifted and the truth is revealed, all we can do is hope that we're strong enough to face it. Story 2. The Frozen Woods. My great-grandfather was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. At 101 years old, he had seen more of life than most, having lived through the hardships of the Soviet Union, fought in World War II, and fled to the United States to escape communism. He was a survivor, tough as nails, with stories that could make your blood run cold. One of those stories, in particular, stayed with me long after he first told it, a story about a night in the frozen woods, where something dark and unexplainable lurked among the trees. It was a few months after the Battle of Illikiluki, a lesser-known but still brutal skirmish between the Soviet and German forces. My great-grandfather and his comrades were stationed in a small isolated village deep in the Russian wilderness. The war had taken its toll on them. They were exhausted, their numbers dwindled, and the bitter cold gnawed at their bones. But on this particular night, they found a brief respite from the horrors of war. The house they were holed up in was one of the few that had survived the onslaught, its walls still intact, providing much-needed shelter from the icy wind. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. The men had managed to scrounge up some vodka, and as the evening wore on, they passed the bottle around, sharing stories and songs, trying to forget, if only for a moment, the carnage they had witnessed. My great-grandfather was there with his closest friend, Sergei, a man he had known since childhood. They had grown up together in Yaroslav, and when the war came, they had enlisted side by side, vowing to watch each other's backs no matter what. That bond had kept them alive through some of the darkest days of the war, and now, as they sat by the fire, they took comfort in each other's company. But as the night wore on, the mood in the room began to shift. Two soldiers, men who were known for their loud mouths and brash behavior, stumbled into the house, their faces flushed from drink. They were troublemakers, always looking for a fight, and my great-grandfather and Sergei had little patience for them. They exchanged a glance, and Sergei suggested they step outside for a smoke, away from the growing tension inside. The cold hit them like a wall as they stepped out into the night, their breath freezing in the air. They pulled their heavy coats tighter around them and lit their cigarettes, the tiny flames flickering in the darkness. For a while they smoked in silence, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the distant howl of the wind. As they finished their cigarettes, they were about to head back inside when a sound reached their ears, a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. It was the kind of scream that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that sent a chill down your spine even colder than the winter air. My great-grandfather and Sergei froze, their eyes meeting in the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Sergei whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. My great-grandfather nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. "It sounded like it came from the woods," he said, his breath visible in the cold night air. For a moment, they hesitated. The scream had been so sudden, so terrifying, that they weren't sure if they had imagined it. But then it came again, even louder this time, the sound carrying through the trees like a ghostly wail. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was out there in the woods, and they were in trouble. Without a word, they turned and ran back inside, their boots pounding against the wooden floor as they burst into the room. The other soldiers looked up in surprise, their laughter dying on their lips as they saw the fear in my great-grandfather's eyes. "There's something out there," Sergei said, his voice shaking. "We heard someone scream. It came from the woods." The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, the jovial atmosphere of moments before replaced by a sense of dread. They had all heard the stories, the rumors of what might be lurking in the forests of Russia, creatures, spirits, things that didn't belong to this world. But they were soldiers, men of logic and reason, and they couldn't let themselves be swayed by fear. Still, the thought of one of their own out there, possibly hurt or in danger, spurred them into action. They quickly gathered their weapons and coats, preparing to venture into the woods. My great-grandfather and Sergei led the way, their rifles at the ready as they stepped out into the cold once more. The night seemed darker now, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, making it difficult to hear anything else. They moved cautiously, their breath coming in short, visible puffs, the snow crunching underfoot with every step. As they entered the woods, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The trees closed in around them, their branches heavy with snow, blocking out what little light there was. The group of soldiers moved in a tight formation, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. They hadn't gone far when they heard it again, a faint, pitiful cry, like someone in pain. It was coming from deeper in the woods, and it was closer this time. My great-grandfather felt a knot form in his stomach. There was something wrong about that sound, something unnatural. It was too high-pitched, too desperate, as if the person making it wasn't entirely human. But there was no turning back now. They pressed on, their footsteps muffled by the snow, their breath visible in the cold air. The trees seemed to close in even tighter around them, the darkness pressing down like a weight. The cry grew louder as they approached, and my great-grandfather could see the fear in Sergei's eyes, mirroring his own. Suddenly, they came upon a clearing in the woods, and the sight that met their eyes stopped them in their tracks. There, in the center of the clearing, were 2 German soldiers. One was lying on the ground, his body twisted in an unnatural position, his uniform torn and bloodied. The other was kneeling beside him, his face pale and contorted with fear. The kneeling soldier looked up as they approached, his eyes wide with terror. He was muttering something in German, words that my great-grandfather couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. He was begging for help, for mercy, for anything that could save him from whatever had done this to his comrade. My great-grandfather and Sergei exchanged a glance, their breath visible in the cold night air. The other soldiers had fanned out around the clearing, their rifles at the ready, but none of them moved closer. There was something deeply wrong about the scene, something that made the hair on the back of my great-grandfather's neck stand on end. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The kneeling soldier's eyes flicked to him, then back to the body on the ground. My great-grandfather could see now that the man was badly injured. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, his chest covered in blood. But it was the body on the ground that drew his attention. It was horribly mutilated, the uniform shredded, the skin ripped and torn as if by some wild animal. The man's face was a mask of agony, his eyes staring sightlessly up at the sky. My great-grandfather had seen death before. He had seen men torn apart by bullets, by shrapnel, by explosions, but this was different. This was something else. He knelt beside the body, his gloved hand trembling as he reached out to touch the man's shoulder. The body was still warm, the blood fresh. Whatever had done this, it had happened recently, maybe just moments before they arrived. He looked up at the kneeling soldier, who was still muttering in German, his words coming faster now, more desperate. "What happened here?" My great-grandfather asked, though he knew the man wouldn't understand him. "What did this?" The soldier didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something in the distance, something just beyond the tree line. My great-grandfather followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, only darkness and shadows. But then he heard it, a low guttural growl, barely audible above the wind. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The other soldiers had heard it too. They were standing stock still, their rifles raised, their eyes darting around the clearing. The growl came again, closer this time, and my great-grandfather felt a wave of fear wash over him. This wasn't the sound of any animal he knew. It was deeper, more menacing, like something that didn't belong in this world. The kneeling soldier's muttering grew frantic, his words spilling out in a rush, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the trees. My great-grandfather didn't need to understand German to know what the man was saying. He was begging them to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But it was already too late. The growl turned into a roar, and suddenly, something huge and dark burst out of the trees, moving so fast that my great-grandfather barely had time to react. He caught only a glimpse of it, a flash of fur, teeth, and glowing eyes before it was upon them. The soldiers fired their rifles, the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing through the forest, but the creature was too fast. It barreled into the nearest soldier, sending him flying through the air like a ragdoll. He landed hard in the snow, his body crumpling with a sickening crunch. Panic set in as the soldiers scattered, trying to put distance between themselves and the beast. My great-grandfather grabbed Sergei by the arm, pulling him away from the clearing and into the trees. They ran blindly through the forest, the sound of gunfire and screams ringing in their ears. The creature was behind them, tearing through the soldiers one by one. It moved like a shadow, darting in and out of the darkness with terrifying speed. They didn't stop running until they were far from the clearing, until the sounds of the creature and the dying soldiers had faded into the distance. Only then did they collapse against a tree, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. What the hell was that thing? Sergei finally whispered, his voice barely audible. My great-grandfather shook his head, unable to answer. He had no words for what they had just witnessed, no explanation for the horror that had unfolded before their eyes. It was as if they had stepped into a nightmare, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. We need to get back to the others, Sergei said after a moment, his voice shaking. We need to warn them. But my great-grandfather knew it was too late. The creature had already torn through their ranks, leaving nothing but death in its wake. There would be no one left to warn, no one left to save. Still, they had to try. With a heavy heart, they pushed themselves to their feet and began the long trek back to the village. Every step felt like a struggle, their bodies weighed down by exhaustion and fear. The trees seemed to press in around them, their branches whispering in the wind like voices from the grave. It was dawn by the time they reached the village. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the snow-covered houses. The sight should have been a relief, but instead, it filled my great-grandfather with dread. The village was eerily quiet, too quiet. There was no sign of the other soldiers, no sign of life at all. As they approached the village square, they saw why. The bodies of the soldiers they had left behind were scattered across the snow, their blood staining the ground. It was a scene of carnage, the likes of which my great-grandfather had never seen. The creature had torn them apart with a ferocity that was almost inhuman, leaving no one alive. Sergei cursed under his breath, his face pale as he surveyed the carnage. We have to get out of here, he said, his voice shaking. We have to go now, before that thing comes back. But my great-grandfather couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on the bodies of his comrades. These were men he had fought beside, men he had shared meals with, men he had laughed with. And now they were gone, their lives snuffed out in an instant by something that shouldn't exist. The sound of movement behind them snapped him out of his daze. He turned just in time to see the creature emerging from the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It moved slowly this time, almost as if it was savoring the moment, stalking them like prey. Run, Sergei shouted, grabbing my great-grandfather's arm and pulling him away. They took off again, their hearts pounding in their chests as they sprinted through the village. The creature was close behind, its heavy footsteps echoing through the empty streets. My great-grandfather's legs burned with exhaustion, but he pushed himself to keep going, to keep running. He could hear the creature gaining on them, its breath hot on the back of his neck. It was only a matter of time before it caught up, before it dragged them down like it had the others. They rounded a corner, and my great-grandfather spotted a small, decrepit barn at the edge of the village. Without thinking, he veered toward it, Sergei following close behind. They burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them, and collapsed against it, their chests heaving with exertion. The barn was dark and musty, filled with the smell of rotting hay. My great-grandfather's eyes darted around, searching for anything they could use to defend themselves. But there was nothing, just old tools and broken furniture. Outside, they could hear the creature approaching, its growls growing louder, more menacing. It was toying with them, drawing out the hunt, savoring their fear. My great-grandfather felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. There was no way out, no escape. They were trapped. Sergei's voice was a whisper in the darkness. "We're not going to make it, are we?" My great-grandfather didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was clear. They were going to die here, in this dark, forgotten place, their bodies torn apart like the others. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. The door shook as the creature slammed into it, the wood splintering under the force. Sergei let out a cry of fear, backing away from the door, but my great-grandfather stood his ground. If they were going to die, they would die fighting. He grabbed a rusted pitchfork from the wall, holding it like a spear, and positioned himself in front of the door. The creature hit the door again, harder this time, and he could see the wood beginning to crack, the door buckling under the pressure. Sergei was sobbing now, his back pressed against the far wall, his eyes wide with terror. My great-grandfather felt a pang of sorrow for his friend, but there was no time for that now. He focused on the door, on the creature that was just beyond it, and prepared himself for the final stand. The door shattered with a deafening crash, and the creature burst into the barn, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was even larger up close, its fur matted and streaked with blood, its teeth bared in a snarl. My great-grandfather's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. He gripped the pitchfork tightly, his knuckles white, and braced himself as the creature lunged at him. Time seemed to slow down as it charged, its massive form filling the narrow space of the barn. My great-grandfather waited until the last possible moment, then thrust the pitchfork forward with all his strength. The sharp tines of the pitchfork pierced the creature's flesh, sinking deep into its chest. The creature let out a roar of pain and fury, its eyes flaring with an unnatural light. But the wound only seemed to enrage it further. It snapped at the pitchfork, its powerful jaws crunching down on the wooden handle, splintering it in half. My great-grandfather was thrown backward by the force of the impact, hitting the ground hard. The wind was knocked out of him, but he forced himself to roll to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's claws as it swiped at him. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing at anything he could find, a broken piece of wood, a rusted tool, anything that could serve as a weapon. But it was no use. The creature was too strong, too fast. It swatted the makeshift weapon out of his hand with a single blow, sending it clattering across the barn. My great-grandfather backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature loomed over him, its eyes glowing with an unholy light, its breath hot and foul. For a moment, he thought it was the end. The creature reared back, its claws raised, ready to strike. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sergei move. His friend had grabbed an old, rusted axe from the corner of the barn and was charging at the creature with a desperate scream. The creature turned just in time to see Sergei swing the axe with all his might, the blade slicing through the air and embedding itself in the creature's side. The creature let out a howl of pain, staggering back as blood poured from the wound. Sergei didn't stop. He yanked the axe free and swung again, the blade biting deep into the creature's flesh. The creature roared, lashing out with its claws, but Sergei was relentless. He hacked at the creature again and again, his face twisted in a grimace of determination and fury. My great-grandfather watched in awe as his friend fought with a ferocity he had never seen before, driving the creature back step by step. But the creature was not easily defeated. Despite its injuries, it continued to fight, its movements growing more frantic and wild. It struck out at Sergei, its claws raking across his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. My great-grandfather's heart skipped a beat as he saw his friend fall, blood staining the front of his coat. The creature, now wounded and enraged, turned its attention back to my great-grandfather. It advanced on him, blood dripping from its wounds, its breath coming in ragged gasps. My great-grandfather knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let Sergei's sacrifice be in vain. With a surge of adrenaline, he grabbed the broken pitchfork handle from the ground and charged at the creature. He aimed for the same spot Sergei had struck, plunging the jagged wood into the creature's side with all his strength. The creature let out a final, agonized roar, its body convulsing as it collapsed to the ground. For a moment, the only sound in the barn was the ragged breathing of my great-grandfather and Sergei. The creature lay still, its massive form sprawled across the floor, blood pooling around it. My great-grandfather stared at the fallen beast, hardly able to believe it was over. But there was no time to rest. Sergei was badly injured, and my great-grandfather knew they had to get out of the barn before anything else happened. He rushed to his friend's side, kneeling beside him and inspecting the wounds. Sergei was pale, his breath shallow, but he was alive. "We have to go," my great-grandfather said, his voice urgent. "Can you stand?" Sergei nodded weakly, and with my great-grandfather's help, he struggled to his feet. They leaned on each other for support as they made their way out of the barn, stepping over the lifeless body of the creature that had nearly killed them both. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the trees as they stumbled out into the open. The village was still eerily quiet, the snow-covered ground stained with the blood of the fallen soldiers. My great-grandfather's heart ached as he looked at the carnage, but there was no time to mourn. They had to keep moving, to find help before it was too late. With Sergei leaning heavily on him, my great-grandfather began the long, painful journey back to the nearest Soviet outpost. The cold bit at their exposed skin, and every step was a struggle, but they pushed on, driven by the need to survive. Hours passed as they trudged through the snow, the forest around them silent and oppressive. The fear of another attack lingered in the back of my great-grandfather's mind, but the creature remained dead, its blood staining the snow behind them. Finally, just as they were beginning to lose hope, they saw it a small group of Soviet soldiers, their uniforms bright against the white snow. My great-grandfather called out to them, his voice hoarse, and the soldiers turned, rushing to their aid. They were taken to the outpost, where Sergei received medical attention for his wounds. The doctors were amazed that he had survived the attack, and they were even more shocked by the story my great-grandfather told them. They had heard of strange things happening in the Russian wilderness, but nothing like this. The creature's body was never recovered. By the time a team was sent to the village, it had disappeared, leaving only bloodstains and broken wood behind. My great-grandfather always believed that the creature had somehow crawled away to die in the woods, but part of him wondered if it had truly been killed at all. In the years that followed, my great-grandfather tried to put the events of that night behind him. He and Sergei remained close friends, bound by the shared trauma of their experience. But neither of them ever spoke of the creature again. It was as if acknowledging its existence would somehow bring it back, would open the door to the horrors they had faced. But the memory of that night never truly left him. Even in his old age, when he would tell stories of the war to his grandchildren, there was a darkness in his eyes, a haunted look that spoke of things left unsaid. He would pause sometimes, staring off into the distance as if he could still hear the creature's roar echoing in his mind. My great-grandfather passed away at the age of 101, taking many of his secrets with him to the grave. But the story of that night in the frozen woods, of the creature that defied explanation, has stayed with our family, passed down through the generations. It is a reminder of the darkness that exists in the world, the things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding, and though I never knew him personally, I can't help but wonder what other horrors my great-grandfather faced during his long life, what other stories he chose to keep to himself, locked away in the recesses of his mind. Perhaps some things are better left untold, buried in the snow and forgotten by time. Story 3. The Uninvited Neighbor. When my fiancée Morgan and I moved into our first home together, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. We had found a modest, charming little house in a quiet town that seemed perfect for us to start building our future. The house itself was small but cozy, with just enough space for us and the possibility of a couple of kids someday. It was the kind of place where we could see ourselves growing old together. From the moment we arrived, the neighborhood seemed welcoming. The day we moved in, we were greeted by an older couple from next door who had lived there for decades. They were friendly and polite, eager to share stories about the neighborhood and offer advice on local services. The neighbors on the other side were farther away, their house nearly hidden behind a line of tall trees, so it wasn't until a few weeks later that we get a chance to meet them. In those first couple of weeks, we were busy unpacking, arranging furniture, and making the house feel like home. We were both working full-time jobs, so our evenings were spent setting up the place and then collapsing into bed, exhausted but content. The house had a small backyard with a patio and some leftover furniture from the previous owners, and we often imagined ourselves sitting out there, enjoying the quiet evenings. It was on one of those evenings, about 2 weeks after we had moved in, that things started to take a strange turn. Morgan was in the kitchen cooking pasta while I sat at the table, browsing for area rugs online. It had been a long day, and the house felt a bit stuffy, so I decided to slide open the back door to let in some fresh air. But as I approached the door, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There, sitting in one of the patio chairs, was a man. He was hunched over, his head down, his face obscured by a long, scraggly beard. His clothes were dirty and worn, and his posture suggested he had been there for some time. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I whispered Morgan's name, trying not to startle her, and told her not to scream, but there was a man in our backyard. Morgan hurried over to where I was standing and peered out through the glass. She gasped and grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What should we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't the biggest guy, and I had no idea who this man was or what he wanted. He hadn't moved since we spotted him, and I couldn't tell if he was asleep, drunk, or something worse. Morgan suggested I knock on the glass and yell at him to leave, but I was hesitant. The man looked bigger than me, and there was something unsettling about the way he was just sitting there, not moving, not acknowledging our presence. Finally, I mustered up the courage and knocked on the glass, yelling, "Hey, you need to get off our property." The man slowly lifted his head and turned to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot, and a strange, almost mocking smile played on his lips. He got up from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked toward the glass door. Morgan and I instinctively stepped back, making sure the door was locked. The man stood on the other side of the glass, staring at us with that same eerie smile. He then shifted his gaze to Morgan and began licking his lips in a grotesque, exaggerated manner. My stomach turned as he started muttering vile, obscene things directed at her, his voice low and raspy. It was as if he was trying to provoke us, to see how we would react. I yelled at him again, telling him I was going to call the police. Without waiting for a response, I closed the sliding blinds, cutting off our view of him, and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, and I could hear the man's voice getting louder, almost yelling now, as he continued his disgusting tirade. The operator stayed on the line with me, assuring me that the police were on their way. It felt like an eternity, but eventually the noise outside stopped. I cautiously peeked out through a gap in the blinds, and to my relief, the man was gone. When the police arrived, they searched the backyard and took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. The man had disappeared without a trace, and we didn't have any video evidence of his presence. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just a random encounter, that the man had been drunk or high and had wandered into our yard by mistake. But that night, as we sat in the living room watching TV, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We both jumped at every little noise, our nerves on edge. We had moved to this quiet town for peace and safety, but now that sense of security was shattered. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard a noise outside. It was a faint sound at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it quickly grew louder. I went over to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the same man standing in our backyard again, this time with a cigarette in his hand. He was talking to himself, or maybe to us his words were a garbled mess of nonsense and insults directed at the house. He must have noticed the movement of the curtain because he suddenly turned and ran toward the window, pounding on the glass with his fists and shouting obscenities. I jumped back, my heart racing, and yelled for Morgan to go upstairs. I didn't want her to hear the things he was saying, disgusting, perverse things that made my skin crawl. Once again, I grabbed the phone and called 911, pleading with the operator to send the police immediately. This time, I didn't alert the man that they were coming, hoping they would catch him in the act. But by the time the officers arrived, he had vanished into the night, leaving us shaken and terrified. The next day, Morgan and I decided we needed to do something. We couldn't live in fear, constantly wondering if and when this man would show up again. We went around the neighborhood, introducing ourselves to the neighbors we hadn't met yet, and asking if anyone knew the man who had been harassing us. To our dismay, one of the couples a few houses down knew exactly who he was. They told us he was known for being a troublemaker, a man with a history of violence, particularly against his ex-wife, and a serious drinking and drug problem. He lived in a small, run-down house just around the block from us, and the neighbors described him as dangerous and unstable. Hearing this sent a chill down my spine. We had moved to this town for a fresh start, but now it felt like we were living in a nightmare. We reported everything we had learned to the police, but without any video evidence or direct proof of his harassment, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to keep an eye on the area, but we both knew that wasn't enough to make us feel safe. The days that followed were tense and filled with unease. Every time we stepped outside, we found ourselves looking over our shoulders, scanning the area for any sign of the man. We stopped using the backyard altogether, too afraid that he might show up again. At night, we double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, but it did little to calm our nerves. Morgan was visibly shaken by the entire ordeal. She was no longer the cheerful, optimistic woman I had fallen in love with now. She was anxious and jumpy, constantly on edge. I did my best to reassure her, but the truth was, I was just as scared. The thought of that man lurking somewhere nearby, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike, kept me awake at night. One evening, About a week after the second incident, I came home from work to find Morgan sitting on the couch, pale and trembling. She had been cleaning the house when she noticed something strange. A window in the living room was slightly ajar, even though we hadn't opened it. Her first thought was that she might have forgotten to lock it, but when she went to close it, she found a dirty handprint on the sill. I felt a cold dread wash over me as she told me this. The man had been inside our house. Somehow, he had managed to get in, maybe while we were both at work, and had been wandering around our home. The thought made me sick to my stomach. We immediately called the police, who came and inspected the house, but once again, there was little they could do without catching him in the act. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. We installed new locks on all the doors and windows, and even bought a security camera system to monitor the property. But despite these precautions, the feeling of unease persisted. Every time the wind rustled the trees outside or a branch tapped against the window, my heart would leap into my throat. The final straw came one night when we were lying in bed, trying to get some sleep despite the tension that hung over us. It was a little past midnight when we heard a slow, deliberate tapping on the bedroom window. We both froze, our hearts pounding in unison. As the tapping continued, each sound like a hammer driving a nail into our nerves. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police once more, but something inside me snapped. I was tired of being afraid, tired of feeling helpless in my own home. I handed the phone to Morgan and told her to call 911, then grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and headed for the window. The tapping stopped as I approached, and I could feel my heart racing, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the bat. Slowly, I reached out and pulled back the curtain. There, standing just outside the window, was the man. His face was pressed against the glass, his breath fogging up the window as he grinned at me with that same twisted smile. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with a madness that sent a jolt of fear through me. But this time, I didn't back down. I threw open the window and swung the bat as hard as I could, aiming for his head. He ducked just in time, the bat whistling through the air where his head had been, and stumbled back, cursing at me. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I climbed out the window and chased after him, swinging the bat wildly. He was faster than I expected, and within moments, he had disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there, panting and trembling with adrenaline. I could hear Morgan's voice calling my name from inside the house, but it felt distant, like it was coming from far away. All I could think about was the man's face. That twisted grin burned into my memory. The police arrived shortly after, and this time, they took the situation much more seriously. They conducted a thorough search of the area, and while they didn't find the man that night, they assured us they would increase patrols around our neighborhood. They also advised us to file for a restraining order, though they admitted it might be difficult to enforce given the circumstances. That night, Morgan and I made the decision to leave. We packed our bags, grabbed what essentials we could carry, and drove to a nearby hotel. We couldn't stay in that house any longer. It no longer felt like a home, it felt like a prison, a place where we were constantly under siege by a man who had invaded every corner of our lives. Over the next few days, we made arrangements to move out. We broke our lease, forfeiting the security deposit, but we didn't care. We just wanted to get as far away from that house, that town, as possible. We found a new place in a different town, far enough that we hoped the man wouldn't follow us. As we settled into our new home, the memories of those terrifying weeks began to fade, but the fear never fully left us. We were more cautious, more vigilant, always checking the locks and keeping an eye out for anything unusual. Morgan and I grew closer through the ordeal, but there was always a lingering shadow over our relationship, a reminder of the darkness we had faced together. Months later, we heard from our former neighbors that the man had been arrested for assaulting someone else in the neighborhood. It was a small comfort, knowing he was behind bars, but it didn't erase the fear he had instilled in us. It didn't change the fact that we had been forced out of our home, our lives turned upside down by his madness. To this day, I still think about that man, the way he looked at us through the glass, the sound of his voice as he muttered those vile things. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't opened the window, if I had stayed inside and called the police instead. But most of all, I wonder why he chose us, what twisted thought process led him to our doorstep, to our lives. We've moved on now, but the scars of that experience remain. We live in a different town, in a different house, but the memory of that man lingers in the back of our minds, a constant reminder of how fragile our sense of safety really is. And though we've tried to forget, to move past it, there are nights when I lie awake, listening to the wind outside, and wonder if he's still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.